Schools, by their very structure, are preparing kids for some sort of authoritarian lifestyle. I'm Sheldon Richman. I'm editor of the Freeman, the magazine of the Foundation for Economic Education. Separating School and State, which was the title of my first book, is the idea that the state has no business being involved in education. Thomas Hodgkin, who was, I think, a great libertarian in the early 19th century, said children would be better uneducated than be educated by their rulers. And of course, that's not really the choice we face. Education, I think, would proceed just fine without the state. But if that's the choice, then I would still take education without the rulers. The state has always used education for indoctrination purposes. Schools, by their very structure, are preparing kids for some sort of authoritarian lifestyle. They tell you what to study, more or less. There may be sometimes scope for some choice. When the bell rings, you stop what you're doing, you get up and you move to another room, another subject. Maybe you still want to spend a little more time on the first subject, but no, the bell rang. Got to stick with the schedule. This is the way the early school pioneers, the so-called common school pioneers, beginning with Horace Mann and those people, talked about it. You can find statement after statement about how children are wax, children are plastic, children are dough to be kneaded on the social kneading board. At birth, children are as identical as Fords. I have 3 children, and they're not identical in any way, except they all are strong libertarians. They're sort of close in that way. But that was not the result of indoctrination, I'm proud to say. It's just sort of osmosis. They heard and read and met people and absorbed it. We never sat them down and said, okay, now time for our daily reading from Human Action or Atlas Shrugged or anything of that sort. I have been a critic of what's kind of taken the brand name of school choice. Obviously, I'm for choice in education, but school choice has come to mean vouchers and charter schools, where parents are given more options, and this is supposed to present competition to the public schools, and everything's supposed to get better. I am skeptical about all this. First of all, I think it's still a state solution. The money still comes from the taxpayers, funneled through the state, and for most people who are not libertarians, they're going to see that as, quote, public money. And I think they're going to be open to the argument that public money should not go to, quote, unaccountable institutions, unaccountable schools. But accountability to whom? I want accountability to parents. That's what you get when they control the money. Under vouchers and charters, you're going to get accountability to some governmental authority. I mean, there are cases where charters have been revoked, not because the parents thought it was a lousy school, but because the chartering authority said you're not living up to the charter, whatever the mission is specified in the charter. And to me, that's not a free system if that can happen. And until you break the financing link, I don't think you're going to get really what we want to get. The question, of course, arises, how will poor people get educated if there's not the cross-subsidy, which is what happens when government is paying for it by taxing people. We have a lot of new stories to tell about that. James Tooley has done marvelous work in Africa and Asia about some of the poorest places on earth where there are for-profit private schools that poor people go to. So somehow they've been able to begin to figure this out in places that are much poorer than any place in the United States. There's also the obvious answers of philanthropy. There was charitable foundations. There have always been wealthy people interested in education. This happened in the 19th century when there was no income tax to take a deduction from. So they just did it from the love of education and the love of helping poor kids get an education. We see some of it today. I think we'd see a lot more of it if the state were not involved in schooling. And I just think that's not the problem that people believe it is. I think what would happen after a while in a free environment is that you'd see combinations, hybrids really, of what we think of as traditional homeschooling, right? The kids sitting around the kitchen table with one of the parents or both of the parents, and some community mixing. I mean, you see it today. I live in central Arkansas. When my kids were still of school age, they were essentially homeschooled, although more in the unschooling mode of John Holt. I mean, John Holt developed this idea of unschooling, and his newsletter was called Growing Without Schooling. And it meant there was no strict curriculum. But at the same time, once a week, a couple hundred kids would get together and they would have classes where in things that maybe individual parents felt that they weren't expert enough to teach. So it was a pooling of resources by a lot of families, and either some of the parents did have the expertise and therefore could teach to a whole bunch of children, or they'd even bring in someone they knew who wasn't maybe a parent of any of the kids there, but knew something about some subject. I gave an 11-week course on Introduction to Economics, which was essentially Introduction to Austrian Economics. And I had kids from 6 to 16, and they loved it. They loved it, all the ages, because these were bright kids, they were precocious, and if there were no rules being imposed by the state, I think people would stumble on even new ways of doing things. That's the thing. We got to keep it open-ended. We need to do what Joseph Priestley advised for education, and he said for all of the arts. Namely, we have to allow for trial and error and experimentation, and as he put it, complete liberty and even caprice. I love the phrase. That's what we need. We need to have it open end so people can try things. If it fails, it'll fail quickly, and something else will be tried.